Good morning everybody, or good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar specifically for starting with Capture One Pro for Sony. So today I'll try and touch on some more points which are really relevant to Sony cameras and the application itself. So the goal is today really to not go in depth on any particular subject, but just to give you some advice on getting up and running as fast as possible. So we'll touch on making a new catalog, getting some images in there, a very brief bit on organization, how the interface works in Capture One and what you can do to customize it. Excuse me. Some basic tool behavior and how to copy and apply, and then finally exporting some images out. So hopefully we can squeeze all of that in the time we have today. If this is your first webinar and you don't know who you're listening to, my name is David. I'm part of the software sales team based out of Copenhagen in Denmark. As usual, we have 60 minutes to squeeze all that stuff in I just mentioned. You're very welcome and encouraged to ask questions throughout. If you're on your Mac or PC, at the bottom of your GoToWebinar control panel, the last part you'll see is called questions. So pop a question in there, that will come straight through to me. If you're on your iOS device or Android device, you'll see a question mark icon at the bottom. Tap that and you can ask a question in the same way. This is all being recorded, so don't worry if you can't remember anything. You can always review it again tomorrow. You'll get a follow-up email roughly this time tomorrow, and it'll have information on our YouTube channel where the recording is stored. Okay, so without any more chat from me, let's go straight into Capture One. You might find that the cursor is highlighted like this from time to time, so you can see where it is, just to help you locate it when I'm moving around. Okay, so we're going to go right back to the start and start from the beginning and make a new catalog and get some images into it and go from there. So let's close this one down and we're going to say File, New Catalog right here up at the top. Let's give our catalog a name. So we call this Sony. Let's call it Capture One Sony, like so. Okay, so that's going to make us a new catalog, and I should say in that dialog, if I just go back into that dialog, by default it will go to the pictures folder on your system. If you want to change that to a new location, just hit the box here and then you can choose a different location. Equally, if you want to move your catalog database around, as that's all we've created so far is our Capture One catalog database, there's no reason why you can't pick this up and move it anywhere else once you've created it. As simple as that. So what we've created really so far is just the catalog database, which tracks the location of your images and knows certain things about them, like adjustments, metadata, organization, and so on. So right now we're not concerned with the location of images, it's just our catalog. For the best performance in Capture One, if you can store that internally on your computer, and if it's on an SSD, so much the better. But otherwise, you are not really restricted placing it anywhere. It's just for best performance, internal SSD is the way forward. Okay, so now we have a brand new empty catalog. We have to get some images inside the catalog, or import some images to the catalog. A catalog is not a browser. There's nowhere I can go in Capture One and just browse the contents of my hard drive. We have to physically tell Capture One what part or what images we want in our catalog. So it's a conscious decision, which also means that you can only put, the very best in your catalog. And as you've made a conscious decision what to store, it actually makes it easier to search and filter for various images anyway. Now you can probably guess the large import button in the middle will start you off with importing images, or we can simply say File, Import Images up here. If we do that, it will open the Import Images dialog, where we can begin to import our first set of images into Capture One. Now, the only two parts of this dialog, the Import Images dialog, you really have to pay attention to is Import From and Import To. Everything else is bonus stuff. So as long as you start at the top and work your way down, you cannot go wrong in this dialog. So import from the source. This is where we're getting images from. Now typically this would be from a camera memory card, of course, or it could be images that already exist somewhere on your computer or attached hard drives or servers or something like that. So in this case, I'm going to navigate to, by saying choose a folder, find my external hard drive, this one here, and just grab a folder of images to import. This is just one folder of images. If you want, we can also check include subfolders, which means if our folder structure is a bit more complex on our system with folders, subfolders and more, if we check include subfolders, it simply means Capture One will import everything in that subfolder structure. So let's say open, and we get a preview of all those various different images, like so. We can see we have 41 images. We can zoom in a little bit if we want to make them bigger and so on. So the next dialog, the only one you really need to pay attention to, again, compared to the others, is where do you want those images to go? So most of you will probably choose current location, or you're going to choose a folder. Current location means exactly that. The images will stay where they are. We don't need to move them, duplicate them, copy them or anything. They will simply stay as they are, and Capture One will incorporate them into the catalog and know how to access them. There's a slightly different option called Inside Catalog. And what happens with Inside Catalog is, if we go back to here, when you import with destination set to Inside Catalog, the images will physically go inside the Capture One file itself. So if you're used to using Aperture, for example, or iPhoto as another example, then you'll know that system very well. So the technical term for that is a managed image. So you don't really have to think about the destination of your imported images. Capture One will manage that for you, but they will be physically inside the Capture One catalog file. Now that makes it very easy to pick up the catalog and move it to a different location with all the images in one go, but it does mean that the size of your catalog is going to be restricted to how much hard drive space there is available. Now this day and age, it doesn't take very long to fill up 400 gigs worth of images, sadly. So just bear that in mind if you want to go that route. Otherwise, we can say choose a folder, and then Capture One will allow us to choose a destination folder for our imported images. But I'm going to keep this nice and simple and say current location. So images will stay where they are. Capture One will know how to access them. Now everything else after that, import from, import to, is bonus stuff. So we can back up, make a duplicate copy of raw files if we wish. We can add some basic metadata. We can add some adjustments in the form of a Capture One style or preset. Or we can ask Capture One to auto adjust as well. But none of this is essential. It's just bonus stuff. Okay, let's say import all down here in the bottom right, and the import process will start. Happens pretty rapidly, as you can see. If we bring up the activity window, oh, maybe I hit it, it's probably on my other screen somewhere, then Capture One will make a preview for every single image in the catalog. Now that's an important that's an important setting to be aware of. And the reason why we create a preview of every single image is that it increases or optimizes performance. So when I'm browsing through images like so, Capture One only needs to read the preview file. We don't have to access any raw data until we double click and go to 100%. Otherwise, we're simply looking at really nice, high quality, color managed previews. Now, if you go to your Capture One preferences, then you'll see under the image tab, the first setting allows you to set the size of the previews. So that's the width of our previews in pixels. Now, it's very critical that you make sure your preview size is big enough for the kind of monitor you're using. So if you're on a 5K iMac, you need to be up at 5120. If you're on a 4K iMac or 4K display on your Mac or PC, then you need to be up at 3840. Otherwise, Capture One will not be able to use the preview because it's simply not big enough for the monitor that you're using, and then it will be constantly accessing the raw data and it's going to slow you down. So just be aware of that setting. For me, on my lowly 2560 pixel displays and monitors, that's just absolutely fine. So just be aware of that. So our previews have been created, which means we can browse nice and quickly. It also means when we zoom to 100%, Capture One will access the raw data, and then when we're snapping back and forth between images, as you can see, it's very fast, and Capture One pre-caches that view so it doesn't have to keep building the same view over and over again. Let's zoom out. Just answering Barry's question, is it possible to move an existing catalogue from an external hard drive to an internal hard drive? Yeah, no problem at all. Just if it's open in Capture One, we would just close it down, and then you could just pick up that catalogue and move it somewhere else. No problem at all. But just make sure you close it down first in Capture One. So what's happened after our import as such? We'll come back to the interface of Capture One in a minute, but if we look at the various different tool tabs, these contain all the various different tools that we can use in Capture One. The first one is where we manage our catalogue. It's divided into 3 sections: catalogue collections, which are fixed, we can't change anything here, user collections, and folders. So looking at the folders section first of all, this tells me exactly the location of my images. So it's saying that on Traveler SSD in a subfolder called images to import, there is 41 images. If I was to import something else, let's just grab a folder of something else. Let's just grab a couple of images here, say import all. You'll see that now 2 images belong in this folder called Capture in the subfolder Alex by Alex, like so. So this shows you the exact location of your images. In catalog collections, we can say all images regardless of where they're stored, and we can see our last 10 imports. So the last 10 imports we made with the date and time, and those images that we imported ourselves. Now, if you want to move any images around, for example, you want to grab this image and put it into a different folder, you can do all of that perfectly well within Capture One. Or if you wanted to grab an image and drop it into this folder, then we could do so. If we wanted to pick it up and drop it into that folder, then we could do so. All perfectly capable doing so within Capture One. We can also move entire folders if we wish as well. And my strong advice is to do all kind of moving of images around and so on and so forth inside Capture One itself. The issue being, if let's go to right click and say show in Finder, like so. Oh, show in Finder. My Finder's behaving a bit weird today. Show in Finder or not. Here it is over here, wrong monitor. SSD, images to import. If we were to say pick up the first image, look at this one, 787, and move it in the Finder itself, and then go back to Capture One, you'll now see it has a little question mark in the corner, and if I was to open it, it says it's offline. So by doing that outside of Capture One, we have an issue because now we have to relocate that image. It's no problem. We can just right click on the image itself, say locate, and tell Capture One it now belongs here. And then it will update quite nicely. And if I go to the hard drive itself, then everything's restored and no problems at all. But you can avoid all of that by simply dragging and dropping within Capture One itself. You can also locate on entire folders too. So if you've moved a folder outside of Capture One, then you can also locate its new location. Okay, we'll leave that section there so we don't dwell on too much on one aspect for too long. User collections, we can make organizational tools, and I'll just give you one example. Like we can make simple collections like an album. Let's call this Road Trip USA, which gives us the ability to drag and drop images to it, for example, to give us a different virtual collection. Nothing gets moved from its original location. They're just virtual collections to have images inside them. If you want to know more about managing the catalog, then when you get your follow-up email tomorrow that points you to the YouTube playlist, then you'll find very recently a webinar that was all about catalog management. So have a look through that. Okay, let's talk about the interface of Capture One. So by default, we have our tools over on the left-hand side, our viewer in the center, and our thumbnails or browser on the right-hand side. Now I'm just going to go to the default workspace up in here, Window Workspace Default, just to make sure if you're new to Capture One and you've started up, this is exactly the same as what you're going to be seeing as me. Now, if this workspace doesn't make sense for you, and it's very difficult to make a universally loved workspace, we have this issue, I guess, every time we launch a new Capture One, we try and develop or improve the default workspace to some extent, and we all go away and make what we believe to be the perfect workspace, and 10 people come back with 10 different workspaces. So there is no real true universal workspace, which is why it's great in Capture One that you can customize it exactly to your needs. So if you take a look in the view menu, everything in this menu pretty much is all about customizing the workspace. So for example, if you prefer to have your tools on the right hand side, we can say place tools right and it will switch over. If you prefer to have your browser along the bottom, then we can do that and change to a film strip mode if we wish as well. You'll also find in the window menu under workspace that there's a few options that you can try out. One of them is called migration, which tries to mimic the positioning of Lightroom tools to some extent a bit better as well. Now Lightroom and Capture One are two totally different apps, so we can't match it like for like, but we can hopefully put tools in there which are going to be a bit more similar, or at least in a similar order to what you're used to. Don't forget you can save any workspace that you've made, which will show up down here, and you could also consider having different workspaces for different tasks. I'll just go back to default for a second. If we go to our blog, blog.phase1.com, I'll just go back to the home page, put in the, where is it? It's hiding. Put in the search bar workspace. And then you'll find actually 4 or 5 parts, different workspaces with explanations of why they work for the particular author who wrote that. And you can also download the workspace. So let's just find this one here for example. You can see how it's set up. You can download the workspace at the bottom on some of these posts as well. So it's a great kind of insight into good choices to make on designing workspaces. Continuing on from that, over on the left hand side were all your various different tool tabs here. If you want to change the position of your tool tabs, if you hover the cursor, you'll see it will tell you to do command drag to reorder. On PC I think it's control or option, but if I wanted to have exposure in this position, I can do so. If I want to change the order of tools, I can do so as well. If I want to right click and add any other tool or have 2 of the same tool, then I can do so as well. So these tool tabs are completely customizable as well. So nothing really is locked down in Capture One. So do spend a bit of time making your own sort of perfect workspace as well. Something that you might find which is a little bit different in Capture One to what you're used to is this bar at the top, which is the cursor tools. So they change the behavior of the cursor. So the arrow is just a simple pointer, just allows you to select images, of course, drag sliders and so on. Going across to this one being our cropping tool. So if we grab that, and just so you know, in Capture One, once you've made a crop, you don't have to press enter to apply it or anything like that. Once you've cropped an image, it's cropped. And you'll see the crop boundary until you go to a different cursor tool like the pointer. And then you'll see the crop will disappear and it will snap back up to full frame again. It's worth trying to remember the shortcut keys for some of these cursors. So C for crop on my keyboard, V for the standard pointer, H for the pan tool, this one here, pan, which allows me to double click to zoom in, pan around the image, double click to zoom back out. Wherever I double click, it will zoom in and so on. So V for the pointer, C for the crop tool, H for the hand tool. If you can remember those three things, that will help you move around the application nice and quick. The other shortcut key, which I think is vital to learn and also to change to something a bit more sensible, is the ability to do this, which is to hide and show the viewer nice and quickly with one tap, like so. So if you look in the view menu, you'll see it's the option here, show viewer, which then changes to hide viewer, and you'll see the shortcut key next to it. Now by default, if you don't change anything, it's quite a long shortcut. I think it's Option Command V or Control Alt V if you're on PC, which isn't particularly speedy to use. So any of the shortcuts in Capture One can be changed as well. So if you go to Edit Keyboard Shortcuts, and then you'll find in the View menu, almost the first one, Show Hide Viewer, you can tap this and choose a different shortcut. Now the one that I always set to, this funny symbol, on my keyboard, on my language keyboard, it's the key directly below the escape key. So that's a period in this case, sometimes it's a tilde and so on. But I find that then very easy to just hide and show the viewer, grab another image, double click, it automatically opens, tap my shortcut to hide the viewer, find a different one, whoops, missed it, double click, and so on. So that's a good shortcut. So remember your cursor keys, remember the one for hide and show viewer, and the other useful ones is Command or Alt B to hide the browser, Command or Alt T to hide the tools, and a super easy one, F, just to go into full screen, like so. So nothing too tricky there to remember in itself. So make your custom workspace and save your shortcut keys as well. All right, how do the basic tools work as such? Let me just go back to the default workspace just to make sure I haven't messed anything up. Let's grab our exposure tool, bring this out to the center so it's a bit easier to see. I'm sure you're all capable of using a slider, so of course it's pick it up and drag it to make an adjustment. If you tab into the value of the box, then you can use your cursor keys to go up and down, and shift cursor keys to go into bigger steps, for example, and tab through and put up different values as well, or shift tab and then go back to those other values too. If you click on the name of the slider itself, like so, then it will temporarily reset. So if I just click and hold on exposure, then it will temporarily reset. If I double click anywhere on the slider bar itself, tap tap, then it goes back to 0. So if we've got a load of options like this, I can reset just by double tapping on the individual bars, for example. If I want to reset the entire tool, we hit the little reset icon here, like so. If we want to preview what the tool is doing, then if you hold your Option key down or Alt key on the Mac, then click and hold, that will show you a before and after of the adjustments, like so. As there is no on-off button that you might be used to. So it's Option click to see the adjustments before and after, like so. And click to reset. Now if you want to do a master reset, let's just improve this image somewhat over what it already is. Let's change white balance to, and just change our levels. Okay, so if we want to preview adjustments from a variety of different tools, same kind of rule applies. If you hold your Option key down, or Alt key as you might know it, and click on the master reset, then we can see before and after, like so. If we want to reset everything, that's our master reset, like so, or Command R on your Mac, or Control R if you're on a PC. So that does exactly the same thing. Don't forget you've got multiple undos as well, Command Z. And you'll see here we've got reset, Command R, like so. Up in the top of the menu bar of the tool, you'll see a few little icons. The first one takes us to a help page for that particular tool. A does auto adjustments to capture one's liking. The next one is copy apply adjustments from this particular tool. We'll come back to how to use that shortly. Reset you've already seen, excuse me. And the next one allows us to save a preset for that particular tool. So you can see some options here as we scroll down that list. So you can save a preset from that particular tool itself. And the last one allows us to get rid of the tool, so that would just remove it as a floating tool. We can change the defaults away from 0 for a particular camera if we wish as well. So you'll pretty much find every single tool behaves in the same way. So while we're on the subject of tools, let's just talk about a couple of things terminology wise that is good to know about how the tools work. Again, if we think about saturation, actually if I've got, let's just run a quick, just going to throw up a poll on screen just to see who's awake. If you can see that, then do answer that, because some of the terminology I'll use from hereafter might help you if any of you are using Lightroom or Aperture, for example. Okay, I can see that most of you are awake. That's good. That's good. So thanks for answering that. I'm going to close that down now. Okay, so for those of you who are not so used to Capture One, and even those of you who might be used to Capture One might not know this as well. Let's start at the bottom with saturation, and then we'll talk about contrast for a second. So saturation, if you're more used to Lightroom, you might know the slider as vibrancy, because what actually happens with the saturation slider is that colors that are already very well saturated receive less treatment than those that are not. So there's some built-in protection that stops the oversaturation of images that are already very high up on the saturation scale. So if we go to, let's just open my demo catalog for a second. Incidentally, we can have two catalogs open at the same time, just so you know. Let's find our example image. So this one here, for example, if I grab saturation and pull that all the way to the right, see it does get more saturated, but nothing's gone completely haywire, for example, even though we've got a very strong red up in the corner. So if we take our excellent color editor, for example, and pick the red, you can see it's sitting right on the edge of the spectrum. It's very highly saturated, and change the saturation here, you see it goes off the charts and doesn't look too attractive. So that simply means that the saturation slider here behaves more like vibrancy and has some intelligence behind it as well. Okay, let's say not now for that, and let's talk about contrast for a second. So let's take this image here and we're going to make a new variant, which is just a virtual copy. We're not duplicating the raw file. It's just another variant, which is great if you want to experiment with different adjustments or perhaps make a black and white, for example. And let's make another one, new variant. So we've got 3 identical images. I'm going to shift select them so that we can see all of them at once in the Capture One window, like so. Quick question from Mark. Does Capture One for Sony allow edits to any file type besides ARW, like DNG, TIFF, etc.? You can edit all the non-RAW files like TIFF files, PSD, JPEGs, and so on. As for DNG, that's actually a good question, Mark. I'm going to say yes, but don't hold me to it. But I think DNG should work, but I'm not entirely sure. But definitely yes to TIFF, JPEG, PSD, PNG, and so on. Just not, say, Nikon NEF files, Canon CR2, and so on. You can look at them, you can read them and so on, but you just can't make any adjustments to it. You'll see a little pencil icon in the bottom corner with like a slash through it, which means you can view it, but you can't edit it. Okay, so 3 identical images. Why have I got 3 identical images up here? And I'm also going to add another curve tool down here like so. Wonder if we can make that a bit bigger. There we go. And we're going to have RGB luma, RGB curve here and a luma curve here, and we're going to do some adjustment with contrast here as well. The reason I'm going to such lengths is really that the conclusion that we want to draw at the end is that it's okay to use a contrast slider. Often there's a stigma attached that you should not use sliders in a professional application because they don't do a very good job. And that was certainly the case with Capture One 8 for Sony, but we changed the way the contrast slider works quite extensively. So for example, looking at the image here, let's just add a bit of contrast like so. So nice dose of contrast. Let's leave it at that. Let's go to the next image and try and do the same thing with an RGB curve. So I'm going to pull my shadows down a bit and then bump up my highlights, for example, like so. And now we're going to go to this image and do a similar thing with a luma curve. So let's pull my shadows down and go up with the highlights. Now, what looks different about these 3? Well, first of all, the most obvious thing is that the image adjusted with the luma curve, the color is stable. So we've changed our contrast, but if we option click here, that our saturation level hasn't changed at all. So luminosity curve is essentially what it is, only affects contrast, doesn't mess with our color. So if you're working on an image and you've decided that your color is looking great, but you'd just like to modify the contrast a bit, then luma curve is the way to go. Now with an RGB curve, if we go back to this one, we can make it a bit stronger just to really force the point home. But you can see dramatically the saturation has gone up a lot more when we're using an RGB curve compared to, and we can even go stronger with this one, compared to a luminosity curve. So using an RGB curve, you will definitely get some increase in saturation and or color shift. Now going back to my long sort of explanation of this, if we use a contrast slider, I can push it more. Contrast slider sits somewhere in between the two. So luminosity curve, absolutely no shift in color. RGB curve, lots of shift in color. Fantastic Capture One contrast slider, a really nice compromise between the two. So again, the conclusion of that, don't be afraid to use a slider. It does a really nice job, adds a bit of contrast, gives you a little bump in saturation, because in reality, that's what you expect when the contrast goes up. If you think of a super nice sunny day outside, bright sunshine, no clouds, then everything looks richer, more saturated and so on. Compared to a cloudy day, which has no bright sunlight, everything looks flatter and lower saturation. So when we push contrast up, our good old brain naturally expects there to be more saturation anyway. So the contrast slider is a great compromise between the two. If you don't understand curves, don't be ashamed to use the contrast slider. Okay, how are we doing for time? Good so far. So let's go back to a different image. Any old image will do, really. And talk about a different subject. Okay, so let's reset you and drop that tool back again. What I want to do is touch briefly, as we're talking about Sony in particular, is lens corrections. Let's bring our lens correction panel out. Now this was shot with the 55mm, great lens. Let's find something that was shot with, let's think, something with the macro. Must be something with the macro. That's probably a macro. Yes, it is. Okay, so which image was I just looking at? 55, that'll do. 55 and macro. So two images like so. Now if we go to the macro image, you see it says manufacturer profile. If we go to the image shot with the 55, it actually says site, and let's make this bigger. Oh, I can't. It says Zeiss T-Star FE 55mm 1.8 ZA brackets, etc, etc. So why does this one say manufacturer profile, and why does this one say the long text that we have here? If you see the actual name of the lens here, it means that we physically had the lens at the factory in Copenhagen and done our own Capture One profile on it. If we haven't had the lens in Copenhagen and profiled, luckily Sony have been smart enough to create or put enough data in the raw file for us to be able to do a lens correction anyway. Now the only difference really between these two profiles is that if you look on the phase 1 generated profile, we can correct for sharpness fall off. If we look on the manufacturer profile, this is grayed out. There's no data in the raw file that allows us to correct for that. Now, of course, you have to remember that we can't change a super soft fuzzy lens into some amazing G-Master lens, but we can do something to improve on it. I mean, fortunately, Sony's lenses are pretty great anyway, so we don't really have to do a lot of correction. You'll also see that these sliders by default possibly could change. So you see on the 55 there's very little distortion, so we've left it at 0. On the macro you can probably guess there's very little distortion, so we've left it at 0. On something like what do we got? That's probably with a wide angle. Yep, so that's with the FE28, which has pretty strong distortion, but it's a lens that doesn't cost much. So by default, we've put that to 100%. You'll also see a checkbox here, diffraction correction. By default, this is off. It's only worth ticking this on when you get to smaller apertures. I mean, we're at f8, so I would imagine there's probably not much diffraction issues going on here. But what diffraction correction does is that it does some, well, there might be a slight improvement if I peer at my screen. Diffraction correction does some special deconvolution sharpening that causes, that aids the softness of the image caused by smaller apertures. So probably once you get to f11 and greater, it's worth checking it on and seeing if there's an improvement. Below that, there's no benefit, and all it will do is actually slow the processing time down. If you want to, you can also do analyze chromatic aberration. That will give a better result for your camera and lens combination. No two lens copies are the same, I'm afraid. So even though we do correct and measure chromatic aberration, the best result will be if you physically analyze it. You can do that individually by just choosing analyze here, or if we choose a bunch of images, let's just grab 4 and then choose analyze, then it will analyze all 4 images at the same time. So you can always run that as a batch. And then manually for everything else, for example, if we just go back to our wide angle shot, you can either drag the slider or you can punch the values in to fix the other options as well. But generally, if we don't feel it needs much of a default correction, then we tend to leave that on 0. So don't be alarmed if you see manufacturer profile. It's no bad thing. Sony, as I said, were good enough to put in enough data so that we could do a lens correction anyway, even if we haven't measured the lens personally ourselves. The only benefit of the phase 1 profile is the sharpness fall off additional slider. Okay, so definitely worth mentioning because we're talking about Sony. Okay, next subject, just some sort of basic operations that you might want to do, like copy and apply, for example. So I'm going to go back to my other catalog, this one here, and let's grab a set of images that kind of were shot under the same conditions, this one. Okay, so we've got 24 images here that were all shot under the same conditions, therefore it would make sense if they had exactly the same adjustments on them. So let's open up the first one and do some basic stuff. So let's change the white balance a little bit. So we have a cooler image. Let's add a bit of contrast and exposure and bring up highlights, shadows a bit as well. Okay, so just some corrections for the sake of doing some corrections. Now we would like to get all the adjustments from this image onto everything else. Very simple. Let's say copy, up arrow in the menu bar right here, select all, so that's Command A or Control A, and then apply like so. And that will put the same adjustments across to everything else. But what if we don't want all of the adjustments, we just want some of the adjustments? So let's reset all of these apart from our first one. Reset like so. Go back to the first one, grab our crop, so that's C on our keyboard, and then let's just pop a crop on Alex like so. Go back to our selection, copy my adjustments once more, copy. But before we say apply, we're going to go to the Adjustments tool tab, Collapse Styles and Presets, and looking at the Adjustments clipboard, it shows us every adjustment that we've just applied. And what we want to do then is to take away the adjustments that we don't want to paste across. So I don't want my crop, so I can turn that off, select all like so, and then say apply. And now that's done the adjustments, but it hasn't done the crop. So very simple copy. It shows you go straight to the clipboard, take off what you don't want to have, and then say apply. Now, if you don't like clicking with a mouse, of course, everything in Capture One has a shortcut. So you see we've got copy adjustments and apply like so. So if we were to do that with shortcuts, let's select all and then reset those. So I can say, whoops, excuse me, Shift Command C, copy, select all, Shift Command V, apply like so. So nice and speedy. But what if we only want to take one adjustment from the image and copy it across to everything else? Yes, we could say copy and then deselect everything, which would be a bit laborious. Or we can use the copy and apply in the tool itself. So let's go to composition for a second. Let's just change, what should we change? Let's just change the crop a little bit first of all. So we've got our crop. I'm just going to tweak the crop. Let's make a really tight crop, for example, like so. And there's a slight rotation, but let's reset that rotation. So we just have a much tighter crop like so, and we want to get that to all the other shots, but we don't want to affect any other adjustments. Very simple. In each of the tools, remember there's that up down arrow. So we tap that, you see crop is ticked, and then we simply select all. Helps if you do that first. Select all, press the copy and apply, and then say apply like so, and then you see the crop is changed. Now what we could do, of course, is we can make that even faster. So let's open up this shot. Let's just change the crop to a wider crop again, like so. Select all. Now instead of tapping this, what I'm going to do is hold my shift key down and click the up down arrow, and that suppresses the dialog and it just happens straight away, like so. Equally, if I went to rotation and just pulled the slider and rotate, and I shift click the up down arrow, then straight away we can apply our settings like so. The benefit, or the only time when you might want to actually go into the dialog, is if you want to physically say what part of a tool you want to copy across. So if we went to, I don't know, let's think sharpening, for example. Let's say we only want to change the radius. So if I change the amount and radius and now I press this, Capture One has ticked both boxes. But if I only want to copy the radius across, I can turn that off and then say apply, for example. So it's very powerful the way that you can just decide which adjustments you want to go from one to the other. So copy and apply up here for kind of global all adjustments, copy and apply, and then copy and apply for each individual tool. So Mark is asking, I used my A7 II with vintage Nikon lenses and adapter, so there's no lens info. Could I apply some kind of lens corrections? Yes, you could. You've got a couple of choices. You can say generic, and then you can just grab the sliders to play with it as you wish. If the lens happens to appear, it's probably unlikely if it's vintage, Nikon, there's no reason why you just can't override the profile anyway. But probably what you're going to want to do is say generic, play around with it, and then save that as a preset. So call that my Nikon 35mm or something like that. Okay. So basic copy and apply. The last thing that we kind of do in our typical workflow, if we like, is to export some images. So let's look at a bunch of images and make some exports. So 13 images here. So if we select all of these, the slow way to do it, or the less efficient way to do it, is to say File, Export Images, Variants. And that will bring up a dialog where we can choose TIFF or JPEG, etc., or PSD files, define a destination, set some other parameters like output, sharpening, and so on, and then export. But for example, if I wanted to have, say, a TIFF image and export, and then I wanted to have a JPEG image going to a different place, I'd have to go into the dialog again, change my parameters to something else, change a different destination, and so on. So that's kind of the inefficient way to do it. The best way to do it is go to the second to last tool tab, which is the Process Recipes tool tab. And what Process Recipes allow you to do, let's just delete the one I made this morning, is allow you to set up consistent ways of exporting a file. So I want to have a JPEG that is a certain size and goes to a certain destination, and it's consistent and repeatable. There are some default recipes that you'll find when you open up Capture One, but it's very easy to define your own process recipe. The way you do that is to say plus, new. Let's say we want to make a JPEG that is 2000 pixels wide, and it's going to be srgb. So I've given a name for my recipe. Let's just turn that one off. And now in the process recipe tool, directly underneath, I then set up the parameters. So I said I wanted a JPEG. Quality we'll talk about in a second. I want srgb. The scale I want to be 2000 pixels wide, like so. Now I don't really know, is this quality value too much or is it too little? I have no idea of knowing unless I open up my image, zoom it to 100%, so I can click the big head here, like so. And now if I turn on proofing, which is the spectacle icon in the top right hand corner, then Capture One will proof to the currently selected recipe. So now it's simulating 2000 pixels across, srgb, and with whatever JPEG quality I've got. So now I can adjust this and look carefully and think, how much of a reduction in quality can I get? Because obviously the lower I go, the smaller the file size. So that's a good thing, especially if it's for web, but I don't want to go too low that it's going to ruin my quality. So I can play with that and visualize exactly in Capture One what my output is going to look like. Now it's happening in real time and you can still make other adjustments, but just be aware that Capture One might be a little bit slower if you're proofing images. That's why you only turn it on when you need to have it on, for example. Oh, woohoo, let's zoom back out. There we go. So I've made my process recipe. I've got a recipe checked. Then I need to tell Capture One where to send those images. Just as a little side note, if you want a process recipe to have its own personal destination, you can set it up in the File tab. So by default, it'll use whatever's set in the output location, but any recipe can have its own personal output destination as well. So recipes can go to totally different locations if they wish, or you can use the master location set in the output location tool. So let's choose a folder. Let's say choose folder. Let's go to pictures. Let's make a new folder called catalog exports. Say set as output folder, this one here. And we're good to go. What we need to do now is just go back to our browser view, for example. Whoops. Let's escape out that dialog. Select all. Choose my process recipe. So that was a JPEG, which is going to be 2000 pixels wide. We're sending it to catalog exports. We've defined everything we need to do here. And we're going to say process. You'll see a little orange cog, or red cog, whatever, pop up in the bottom right hand corner, which tells you it's processing. If we tap this arrow, then that will take us to the Finder and show the exports as they come in, like so. Let's see, Harry says, upon completing my work and exiting Capture One, how do I clear the workspace without putting the photos from either a catalog or a session into the trash bin? Not sure I understand your question. I mean, once you quit Capture One, you don't delete anything, you're just closing it. So you don't really need to worry. If I was to quit now, wherever that is, quit Capture One, Command Q, then I don't need to be aware of protecting any images like that. Nothing is not saved, if you like, the adjustments you've made and so on. And yes, Philip, these exported files are adjusted copies of the original raw files which remain untouched. Correct. When you make when you're processing like this, you are making an additional copy. You never, ever, 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 ever edit the raw data. That's like your negative or transparency in the good old days as such. So that never gets changed. Okay. So that was taking our ARW file, I think that's what you're asking, Frank, our Sony RAW file, the .arw, and creating, if we go to our exports folder, a JPEG like so. Now we're really just scratching the surface of what's possible with process recipes. I'll give you a little hint of what is possible, but if you do a lot of export work, to a lot of different formats and to serve different people's needs, then it's really worth exploring what's possible with process recipes. So let's do a JPEG and a TIFF at the same time. I'm going to delete these. Let's get rid of those. So let's have a TIFF, 8-bit TIFF, and let's have a JPEG. And then our output location, you see there's a blank field here called subfolder. So we can ask Capture One to automatically create us a subfolder using a token. And a token points to some kind of image metadata or other variable. So if I click on this box here, this shows me all the possible subfolder tokens. There are lots, you'll only probably use 2 or 3, but I'm going to pick the one that's called recipe name and say OK. And what that means is that as I've got 2 process recipes running, full size TIFF, JPEG 2000 pixels wide, Capture One will put images into a subfolder based on the recipe name, sorting them between JPEGs and TIFFs. So now if let's just do the top row so we're not looking at, whoops, that was a right click. Wacom's gone a bit funny, hang on. Thank you, Wacom. Let's try that again. Shift, oh, I was pressing Control, that's why. So let's take those 4 images and say process. Let's go to our output folder. See, now we have a folder called full size TIFF 8-bit and JPEG 2000 pixels wide, etc. And then our TIFFs and JPEGs are being sorted in there automatically. Now, if we wanted to, we could do the same with output naming. We could use a similar token called recipe name, like so. And then what that will mean is, let's just grab these 3 images here and say process. That when they get processed, that it also adds the recipe name to the file name itself as well. Pretty nifty. As I said, we're just scratching the surface there of what's possible. So if you're interested in being really efficient with your export processes, then I would definitely urge you to watch the webinar that was just about that. Now also, the nice thing about process recipes, once they're set up and enabled, at any point in Capture One, let's just switch to, let's go to a different location, let's grab, or let's say a different location, let's grab this image here. If I do the shortcut, which is process, Command D, so if I do Command D on my keyboard, my process starts running. You can see the process bar up here. It will use whatever process recipes are checked, and it will place that image into those folders as I said before, and there it is as a TIFF, and it's probably just coming in as a JPEG now. So the good thing is you don't ever have to enter an export dialog to do your processing. Once it's set up, you just select the image, do your simple shortcut, and you're good to go. So it makes life much easier. Command D starts processing. Let's go to the output folder, and then you'll see it drop in there in a second. I think it was this one. There we go. Simple, but very powerful. All right, that nearly brings us up to the end of our hour and the end of our workflow. As I said, look out for your follow-up email tomorrow, and that will point to our YouTube channel and all the other sort of tutorials and adjustment guides and previous webinars that we've had. We'll dig deeper into a lot of the subjects that we've touched on today. Last question from Philip. Does Capture One maintain awareness of detached media? For instance, if files are exported to a client-specific drive which is removed for offline storage, will Capture One call for it? Well, if the images are on there from your catalog, you can still see the images. It'll just say offline at the top, as you saw before. If you're exporting to a hard drive and you have it defined here and you unplug it and you try and export, you'll get an error message saying that output location does not exist. But of course, if you attach the drive, then you'll be able to go there. Now, the next webinar is probably of no interest to anyone watching here because it's about Fuji. But unless you happen to be a Sony user and a Fuji user, then you might want to stop by next week because I have a guest, Elvin Rona, who's a Fuji X ambassador and a Capture One user, and he'll take us through some of his techniques that he uses to work with his Fuji images in Capture One. So if you happen to have Sony and Fuji, I'm sure that's very unlikely, then do come along next week, or tell your colleagues who have Fuji to join us on July the 6th. Okay, many thanks for your time today. Do have a look out for that follow-up email tomorrow and use those resources to help you along with Capture One. So many thanks for your time today and hope to see you all soon. Take care.